I'm a designer. I come from the Lancaster Institute of Contemporary Arts, and we have a whole group of designers in a department called Imagination Lancaster. And we work with the creative and digital sector. So a lot of things I was hearing this morning I didn't understand a thing about, and you probably won't understand what I'm talking about, but these two worlds have to come together, and let me show you why. In PETRAS, I sort of lead the social angle, the behavioural aspect of how we're operating in this IoT world. And I come very much from that behavioural angle. I've just written a book called Living in Digital Worlds with a Biologist, and looked at how we as humans have developed and how we're actually continuing to develop in this space. What I wanted to talk about is the work that we've been doing on PETRAS, where we've been looking at living, working and moving in the IoT, particularly using design futures as a technique to start to understand the implications. Now, as an ordinary person, I tend to feel like we're living in the digital public space. We're living between the digital and physical worlds. And when you sit in a cafe with your laptop or your phone, you're living in this sort of virtual and physical space, and sometimes you don't even know that you're in a physical space and there are people around you, and sometimes you do, but you certainly don't necessarily think about the security in the digital world, but you do if you're sitting in a physical space and the security of the physical world. And I did for the Home Office about 15 years ago, a lot of work on designing against crime. So I'm sort of bringing some of that thinking to this space. Also, the sort of figures that everybody's been talking about this morning mean nothing to the ordinary person who's buying stuff. You know, whatever, all this data flying around in places, it means nothing to us. So how do we start to think about how people are going to react and what the implications are for privacy, ethics, trust and security, which is what the PETRAS program is about. In fact, a styling type designer actually said that we will need those type of designers working on this now in 1999. So the trillion node network was thought about then, and it was thought that designers, artists, and the styling world, the creative world, needed to work on it as much as the engineers. And this is the way some of the design world are thinking about it. So I'm going to take three groups in PETRAS that are working on it. First of all, IoT in the home. Paul Colton, who works with me at Lancaster University, and his team have been looking at exploring adoption and accessibility. And they've looked at it from thinking about the person not being the center of the IoT. Often designers, well, throughout our careers, we're taught to think about human-centered design, people-centered design, human-centered interaction. We're starting to think about the designer, the person being in the center of the, not in the center of the constellation being numerous devices and people, and not thinking about the person in the middle of it. So, not like the right, but like the left, although they're all creatures, but actually us being part of that constellation. And when you start designing things from that perspective, you start to we use something called design fiction, sometimes design speculation, sometimes world building. So we make products and things, and we tell the stories about them. So everybody knows about the internet kettle, and we bought one. But we start to look, we gave this kettle a name, it's called Polly, and we started to understand and try and transmit what Polly was doing. Polly had its own Facebook page. Polly would tell you all the data it was releasing to the world. It was designed so it would give you all the information that was happening and being connected out there to try and get people's understanding of how they thought about that, what implications it had, would they buy Polly. We gave it packaging, we gave an advert, etc. We with our PhD students and our students, develop these products these fictitious products to test them with the users. And therefore, it would be interesting to talk to the security people to say, okay, what are all the implications for a device like this? We're looking the other way at how much people would take it on board. In fact, I have a PhD student who had kidney failure halfway through it, and he moved his whole PhD into designing communication systems for diet and kidney patients on kidney dialysis. So we went much more from the fiction to the practice of how you develop these sort of products.
Alexa, discover new devices.
Starting discovery. This can take up to 20 seconds. Discovery is complete. Smart lock found. Check your Orbit privacy app.
So this was a design fiction film to sort of illustrate to people how many devices they might have in the home, how you might find that device, and how you might start to be aware the degree to which that device was sending data outside your home to other organizations and further. So it's a fiction about how you might start to. It was like the fridge colouring thing, but you actually had control of it. Now, it's a fiction, but again, it's to start to think about how we might design IoT for GDPR, etc. So the tales of the park you've just heard about. So I'm going to just briefly, that's the same sort of thing, putting things in the park, testing it, and so on. So then we get to beyond money. So we've heard some work this morning about Bitcoin and banks and so on. So Chris Speed at Edinburgh University is creating fictions. This one is The Bit Barista. It was featured on Click, on BBC Click not long ago. And it's really using Bitcoin to purchase coffee, but also that will tell you where your coffee bean's coming from, which one you want to choose, and it's looking at the implications of using Bitcoin in the purchasing of ethical purchasing of coffee. I think that's about that one. And then the other one is how you might use IoT in social situations. So this is, as you watch it, you get a cup, but you don't get your free coffee, unless you've actually matched your cup. So it's a bit like speed dating in conference circumstances. It's a way of looking at how you can use those sort of systems to force social circumstances. And Chris played around with these sort of activities and these sort of techniques. And then GeoCoin, which is a way of collecting geocoins in a streetscape, but also paying for services for it. And he's been working with the Royal Bank of Scotland on these sort of, again, digital design fictions to actually illustrate potential, but also the potential security and the potentials in terms of adoption, acceptability by users. So that was the design bit, the design fictions, how we're using that. And actually, if you think about it, there are lots of small digital and creative startups experimenting like this. It's not just that we as academics are doing it. There are other small startups that are doing it. We also, in PETRAS, have been using scenario building and imagination. So the PETRAS team is 8 universities. When we get together, there's about 60 academics and researchers. And we spend some time building fictional scenarios around different aspects of the world. This one was looking at a smart city and looking at extreme scenarios. So, okay, this smart city infrastructure is no longer trusted. There's mass relocation from the city. It's just making people think about, well, the other issues to do with the hype around a smart city. More recently, we get the whole team, and in this team there are the crypto specialists, the ethicists, the computer scientists. We get them all around the table with the designers and get them to imagine journeys. So in this one, we ask them to imagine the journey of a passenger in an IoT-enabled intelligent transport system, and they started to understand that complex multi-stakeholder system and how it would work, but also all the issues to do with that system, because we're talking about complexity of system, when we're talking about the whole process of designing those systems. And then finally, we went back to living in IoT and the human within the systems. And some of the major challenges we on PETRAS see are around transactions and values and the constant renegotiation of consent that it has to happen. The changes from one environment to another, and how do you make it understandable and controllable. What is secure today might not be tomorrow. Transparency, how much information is too much information? Is privacy dead, or is it fluid, and where is it fluid, and how do people think about privacy? Redundancy of the systems, do we own systems or do we rent them? Accountability, where does it all go wrong? And all the discussion around trust ratings, rankings of peoples and objects, and nefarious ratings. So we just came up with a whole list of other questions. But in terms of design, what we have obviously noted is, and in computing you'll know this because it's been happening for years, but in design, in product development, we have always used a linear process. You know, you start with understanding the brief, you start to understand the manufacturing needs, you start to understand the consumer needs, the marketing needs. You design something, you develop it, you put it out in the street, and that's it. Well, in fact, now it is not a linear process. It's discovering, defining something, developing it, and constantly going around in a loop. And that's why we think using design fiction, design scenarios helps us to do that more rapidly and understand the object and in the IoT, and seeing us all as objects in that relationship with the physical products, the digital products, the services, and the places in which they operate. Actually, what we think is we, as designers and creatives, need to embrace the mess and complexity. We're struggling with that all the time, and people don't behave in an ordered way. And I think it's interesting because we operate like this, and listening to the complexity that the scientists and the engineers are dealing with is fascinating from somebody who's dealing in a human-centered, from a human-centered background, from a sociology and humanities background, understanding the sort of deterministic, very, very powerful way in which the computer scientists work means we do have to operate at those boundaries, because that's radically changing how we live in the digital world. Thank you.